YouTube page on my phone, so I can see.
So you can see it.
Yeah.
Or you can see us.
Third
Well,
generation.
If,
But we grew up in Longview, Colton was working
if
at
it
Methodist Church
right,
that
yep,
disability.
we just look like, that's us.
The church that we helped start.
Do we have to, do we know how to record?
You are being recorded.
Yep.
So it's recording right now?
So,
But I don't
have
think
YouTube.
we don't want to go live just yet.
And then.
That's fine.
That's what I hear.
Because when you stop going live on YouTube, it uploads.
Oh, okay, so we'll just leave it.
Oh, yeah.
So there's the edit videos, keyword, yeah.
That's saved. Yeah, once it's saved and it's live, and I think we can just top it off. Yeah.
Was amazing.
We're just leave it.
You know, and.
So this is interesting.
Talk about it.
Culture.
Yeah.
Perspective on
Thank you.
things.
Yeah.
I listened to, I went to elementary school and that's.
Okay, so
Now it's already after, but that's the heart of that. Right, like this lionized figure,
Yeah.
you know, this dancing, this romanticized kind of. Even in the.
That email.
Yeah.
Marcel, that's me. There, that's the handout. I think.
Yeah, there was a handout in email, Marcel,
Same thing I had, back in being a slave,
but maybe,
and you.
Sorry, there was an email?
there was an email.
I didn't get one.
John Seaman.
Okay, let me see if I have
I
one.
didn't get one.
No, it's
You didn't get one
a
either.
sanitized version of history.
So we had,
That's the word.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm
And even
trying to do.
Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
But I don't, there's no email address.
Openness with
Yeah.
the black woman,
It's just so interesting that even in the north, textbooks are so slanted.
Scotty, I wouldn't look bad.
we all ended up here.
Hey, Marcel, can you put your email address in the chat?
Well, Leon's retiring.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you can also just upload it to the like Zoom meeting, I believe. But yeah, I can put my email in there.
I can't, it's on two different.
Yeah, it's on two
computers.
different computers.
Okay,
But maybe,
send to this one.
can you paste the handout?
It's well beyond my capability, so the easiest thing is just get an email.
All right, so it is,
That's.
is
Remarkable.
that supposed to be Gmail?
They've taken.
No, it's Ymail. It's
All right.
Yahoo Mail, which is
Oh,
fine.
all right, so it's different.
Okay.
Am I good? Or,
You know,
Yeah.
I'll do it, look at this real quick.
Just the discrimination by.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Yeah.
And I, even though it's forbidden, I'm sure it's still like the circus cats. I'm sure that's what it exists.
With that email.
Is it right?
Yes.
Oh, for sure. If that was early on. All service people.
Yeah, when I said it fully, I ran off. It's like, that's gonna be something. That's what I was like, where someone else came by, it was just.
Spit on and.
Yeah.
I was. 70.
And the choice of different days as well, different, you know, they.
Drop on you.
Yeah, base, yes. Yeah. That was nice.
All right. We're going out now.
Is away from.
The size of the built.
It's part of the same.
In, you know, for us.
Mhm.
And just the way they treat them. And. It was like.
Do you know where the list for my spot for the either vacation council? I did not see that.
I think you're good this time.
Also been.
The-
Okay, which I.
That would be too much, too much going on.
Too much.
Right.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Thank you, buddy.
There's a reason I didn't pick up that.
Yeah, I'll hold
I just know that. I can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there it is.
Very good.
Yeah.
It was just, you didn't put it down about that piece of it.
Sure. No, you were great.
I look so scholarly up here with my computer and everything.
But anyway.
All right, we'll wait another 2 or 3 minutes. Do a lot of, obviously a lot of traveling to other places, primarily down in Latin America and the Caribbean now, but we do what we call intersectional PTCs, video teleconferences with a lot of the partner nations that with groups anywhere from like about 5 to 50 different people, and we have interpretation teams that are on LinkedIn and everything like that, because I don't speak Spanish. And sometimes we need them for the Jamaicans too. But invariably, if we say something starts at like 11 o'clock, it'll be 11:15 before everybody, you know, it's like, hey, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I have to drop and rejoin. Yeah.
Did you send out another email to me?
Did I send one out to you, Kitty?
I haven't gotten one.
No. It was just to Marcelo. He didn't have the handout. Did you get the one with the handout?
No, I did not get a handout.
All right, I will send the same thing to you.
I can just upload it if that's easier.
Yeah, but I'm working off about 3 different computers and.
No, I'm saying I can do it. I have it now, so I can just put it in there.
That's great.
So anyone who needs it can just get on it.
All right, I'm zooming in on you, John.
That's dangerous.
It's one more than you.
So Kitty, you didn't get the email that I sent out from me. It came from me this week, not Josh.
Right, I did not get it.
Wow, okay. I wonder if nobody else got it.
I got it.
You got, okay.
Who knows?
I feel like this is prejudiced against the virtual people.
Hey, we're all made in God's image.
Even the virtual.
Yeah, but our image is filtered through Microsoft Windows.
It's still in the image of God.
Although I'm driving into church this morning, I was listening to I want to say it was like one of the CNN or something talking about, there was an article that came out that the extinction threat to humans is not as much climate change as it is AI,
Yep.
growing AI.
You're gonna figure out AI. I'm not sure what we're gonna be able to do about it.
All right, let me see.
Hey, John. Hey, John.
Good morning.
It's in the front row.
When the brave people up here. Hey,
All right, Kitty, coming your way here.
Okay,
Oh, my mama.
Oh, hey.
Oh.
Wait, mama. There you go. Well, Kitty, come on now. So that's on you. We have both of the co-moderators' mothers pending vertical. Although Josh decided, I think he had some early tea times. He's on vacation, so he is not going to be with us today, which is okay. Come on in. Come on in, Diane. How you doing?
Close to the coffee.
Get some coffee.
Do you have your priorities?
Online people on there.
We are, all right, so we've worked our way, we have already hit YouTube live button. All right,
Yes, we have. We are.
okay, while Diane's getting a cup of coffee, I think we'll get going here. Welcome to the second class of the Robert E. Lee and me book review, I think. Is not an inaccurate way to refer to this class. But again, we're using the book as a vehicle to understand institutional and structural racism. Okay. And the lens that we're going to use this book is to look at the author, who was a career Army officer and a career historian. He was the head of the Department of History at West Point when he retired. To sort of trace his journey as when he was growing up as a young child in the South, various parts of the South, and how he was sort of subsumed into the Southern lost cause myth. And to the point where, as a youngster, all he wanted to do in his life's aim was to be a Southern gentleman in the manner of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate generals. Okay. And then only after he became a historian, went to graduate school, taught at the Department of History, went back, got his doctorate degree, and then came back as a permanent professor at West Point, eventually to be the head of the department. Did he really use his historian's tools to sort of go back and look at this idea of the lost cause myth that revolves around the Civil War? And so this book is as much his journey as anything else. And so what we want to do is, in this week, we're going to start at the end. Okay, chapter 7 was the reading assignment. And we're going to look at his conclusions. He calls it his verdict. Okay, chapter 7. We're going to take a look at that and sort of lay that out on the table, bare bones. Okay. Because what he does, I mean, the language he uses, the forthrightness and the directness with which he writes, and the words and the verbs and the nouns and the adjectives that he uses are all very intentional, and they're supposed to be in your face. So as you were reading this, if you got that sort of like, whoa, you had to hold the book away from you a little bit when you were reading it, that was his intent. And we'll find as we go through the rest of the book, throughout the rest of the class, that he uses that kind of language throughout the book. It's not as condensed as it is in his verdict, right? Because he takes 200 pages and intersperses with his statements, his truths. He uses a lot of historical evidence and things like that. I mean, he is a historian, right? But it's very impactful when he pushes it all together in this last chapter. And he does that intentionally because it's not as dense throughout the book, and he wants at the end to really make sure that the point is driven home. So we want to start at the end, get that feeling and know exactly what his conclusions are. And then we're going to go back, and because when you read this, I mean, I'm struck by, you know, the inarguability of his argument, as it were. And then we'll go back and we'll say, well, okay, if this guy, I mean, he's, you know, a 30-year plus career Army officer, a trained historian, you know, how did he get to this point? How could he be at this point? But then his whole life, all he wanted to do was revere General Lee and be a Southern gentleman like him. And so we'll go on that journey over the next couple of weeks. But we wanted to start at the end and then come back and watch how he gets subsumed into this Southern myth, and how he does that gets to the heart of what structural racism is. Okay, because that's how he was, at some point in the book, I think he uses the term brainwash. Okay. But that's how he gets to that point in his life. While we're on that journey over the next couple of weeks, what we also want to do, even though he's looking at society at a different time and a different place than maybe we are right here in Austin, Texas. And his lens is the military as a broader institution, and then West Point as he has a whole chapter about, you know, well, okay, this isn't just, you know, Southern Army posts that this is happening at, and these aren't just laws, you know, that were put in place in an older society. This is endemic at the place that's supposed to be the pinnacle of our college education, our military, you know, at West Point. And I was actually struck when I was reading that myself. I went there for 4 years, almost 4 years, and I didn't realize the degree to which that, and then I went on my own little journey, and I was like, well, okay, you know, I believed in that because that's what I was taught. And so you tend to believe what you're taught and tested, especially at West Point. So that's the overall aim of the class. Okay. What I want to do, because Josh tells me this is how we have to do it, but I think it also serves some purposes, because, you know, we're not just a book study club, right? We are a Sunday school class. So what we want to do is go through a couple of the parts of the handout. So I have the handout, and I think hopefully Marcelo and Kitty, you have it now. Mom, I don't know if you had a chance to print that out or not, but no worries, you don't need it. You can just follow along. So I'll lead us on the opening prayer, and that means that one of y'all get to pick the closing prayer to read. And then we'll go through the commitments of presence. Okay, so please join me in a brief opening prayer. Holy and ever living God, you have commanded us to pray for those who persecute us. And we ask that your zeal for justice enter into the hearts of those who have set themselves against your salvific purposes. May we repent, our sibling Jesus, of believing the lie that you are a state God. Correct those who twist your words against your people, and in the authority of Christ, may we be empowered to embrace and stand firm in our God-given dignity in whatever way you call us to do so. Amen. I don't know if we were supposed to read that corporately or not. I thought that was nice, spontaneous, and you all saved me from having to pronounce salvific. I wasn't quite sure how to say that word. So the next thing is we have in the handout the commitments of presence. And so we'll do just like we did last week. We'll go through, I'll start with A, and then Diane, if you could do B, and then we'll just work our way around the room. And we'll take whichever one is open when you come to it. So I'll take A. Be fully present. Set aside the usual distractions of things undone from yesterday, things to do tomorrow, and things impinging on the present through technology. Diane?
Listen generously. Listen intently to what is said. Listen to the feelings beneath the words. Listen to each other as you would listen to scripture, attentively, mindfully, and open to the holy.
We come as equals. No person's gifts, limits, or experiences are more or less important than another's.
It is never share or die. You will be invited to share stories, but you will determine the extent to which you want to participate.
No fixing. We are not here to change someone else's mind or fix them.
Suspend judgment by creating a space between judgments and reactions. We can listen to another person and to ourselves more fully.
Learn to wonder. If you find yourself becoming judgmental or cynical, try turning to wonder. I wonder what my reaction teaches me. I wonder what they are feeling right now.
Practice confidentiality here. What is said here stays here, but what is learned here goes out.
Welcome discomfort and dislocation. Move against an instinct to construct a mental space of safety or to check out. Love the questions themselves. Let your questions linger. Release the compulsion to answer them or to have them answered.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we'll get into the content. So, like I said before, we're gonna start at the ending. We want to start with the verdict, okay? That was chapter 7 and the epilogue as well. So I will open it up for just sort of an initial discussion or sharing session for folks to share, but it's not share or die, but to share your thoughts on this last chapter. Okay, looking for things like tone, word choice, things like this. I don't think that you can read this chapter and somehow miss miss what the author is saying. So anybody want to share what they think or felt about how the author said it?
Reason.
And
Man was a traitor to his country.
yep.
And whatever anybody may say or make up or, try to find another way to look at it. That's not true. And that's not, he's right. I think that is not. Even for those of us that weren't really infiltrated into this cult of Robert E. Lee. Still, that's not what we ever learned. It was a war and we had a disagreement, and Robert E. Lee was an extremely talented military man, and he was fighting for what he believed in, and this whole idea that he swore an oath to his country and lived by it for decades, and then went against the oath that he swore.
Okay.
We just don't. That really struck me.
No, you're right. I mean, it's treason is half of it. But you're exactly right. Treason was it was almost irrefutable. And even though because of a number of intervening activities, we eventually signed an oath on October 2nd, 1865, and a reaffirmation kind of oath. He was never tried and found guilty of treason under Article 3 or Section 3, Article 3 of the Constitution. But that's a technicality because he fell under the general amnesty, okay, that the president had out. But absolutely treason. And it says Article 3, Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution says pretty simply, treason against the U.S. shall consist only in levying war against them, the states, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Okay, and then it talks about you have to have two people that'll witness it and all that, but that's the aid and comfort clause of the Constitution. Okay, undeniably. So treason, absolutely. What was the other thing?
I got that, Robert E. Lee really was morally bankrupt because he put the owning of slavery or the perpetuation of the slavery forever was one thing that he just kept pushing,
Yep.
pushing was he believed that he should be able to own another person.
Yeah, I was shocked reading the section about when he was executing his father-in-law's will.
Yep.
That was, that was shocking to me.
I had no idea.
No.
So it's not only in the depth of it, right? So the author, even in the short chapter, hits you over the head, but he starts by saying the reason that he committed treason was because he believed in the Southern cause, which was the perpetuation of slavery. And it's not only that he believed in it because it was an economic model or whatever. He personally profited from owning almost 200 slaves. He inherited them, yes, but he owned them, and then the disposition of the will. But then he goes even further and gets into his writings from before, during, and after the Civil War. So and says that he didn't believe he did anything wrong, right? And some of the writings, I wrote them down here. He continued to speak out for the Southern lost cause, and these are in quotes. The Negroes must be disposed of, or the white South would subvert emancipation, work against the law, after. Lee also argues that Black people were needed as, quote, the laboring population, and quote, had neither the intelligence nor qualifications for political power. Post Civil War writings, right?
Yeah. And that's that was also a major thing, but that wasn't the thing that surprised me, because it's always made perfect sense to me that of course it was all about slavery. Anybody trying to pretend like it wasn't is just dancing around the fact. So that part that part was not as surprising to me or shocking as this point of view, which is, can't really disagree with, but I just had never really thought of it that way before, that he was a traitor to his country.
Right. So yeah, the treason part was the part that sort of hit me, because you think the Civil War, even at West Point, I talked about that poster, the recruiting poster, about much of the history we teach was made by the people we taught, and it was Grant and Lee looking at each other in the center of all of these other ring of famous people, you teach at West Point. I wouldn't say they glorified it, but they did, because most of the battles of the Civil War, the two generals on either side were graduates and friends, and things like that. And they glorified it by, our teachers reading to us out of the diaries of the two generals on the opposing sides of some of these wars or battles during the war, that said, "Oh, I wonder how Jubel's feeling tonight, and whether he's eating, that fried chicken he really likes or whatever." And on the other side, "Well, I wonder if, Harry, said his prayers that we used to say when we were roommates." Complete glorification. But you said an interesting thing, I think, that at the very end, the author himself realizes, the facts. The whole idea of how racism and things like this are institutionalized or are structural in nature is you don't have access to the facts, right? And so the author said that, and I'll read here out of it, said, once I, as the author, accepted the simple fact that enslaved people were people who deserve the same rights as any American, my whole thought process changed. And so this, he, is after reading, what happened after the Civil War. It pained me to admit that I thought that before 1861, not real people as white Southerners, then after 1865, they became real people.
Yeah.
Right? But he had no exposure. All of these, facts, get buried or discarded, in favor of, like, I guess the current day political commentary kind of things, right? They may start with a small fact or something that gets twisted, and then from that comes the rhetoric and the myth and the commentary, right?
I was really struck by, I'm a big, when I'm reading nonfiction, I always look back and forth to the notes. And in this chapter, I would say half of the citations are from the one biography written by the one last name Pryor, Elizabeth Pryor, I think is his name, who that book was written in 2007. And that's where a lot of the stuff about Lee, his slavery stuff, a lot of that stuff came from a book that wasn't written until 2007.
Yeah.
And she obviously did a lot of research, and that's where he got a lot of his, and if you read some of the other citations, there's the Lee myth is in a lot of the other biographies that are written. So the biographies that were available until 15 years ago were glorified.
And what
No
did
one would publish the other.
The real truth. Well, and
The
they,
publishing house would have said, oh, no.
We're not talking that.
Well, but that's through a lot of those biographies, because if you look at specifically the treason part of the verdict, right? He mentions like 4 or 5 of the leading biographers of Lee, and these are the words they use about Lee's decision. They don't even touch the slavery.
right.
Okay, they don't even talk about that. But they talk about, they try to justify or ameliorate. They say things like Lee's decision that was the decision he was born to make. No, it's not Jesus on the cross, right? We never had a Garden of Gethsemane moment, right? But there is a funny quote in here from one of Lee's cousins, I think, who said that, as Lee, read over his prayers about whether to leave and join the Army of Northern Virginia, he says he wished that Lee had read his commissioning oath instead. So the other thing was that Lee's role and decision was foreordained by birth and blood. The Southern gentleman myth, right? Of course you're a Virginian. Of course you're gonna,
That's how you act.
support. Also, that Lee had no choice in the matter. Right? And that to go against the decision he was born to make, or that he was foreordained for this role by birth and blood and had no choice in the matter, if he had gone the other way, right, and taken the offer from General Scott to come and lead the Northern, to stay in the Army and lead the Army, that would have been the other way was the coward's way out. Right. So, I mean, obviously, when that is, the leading biographers of the time are writing about that. Now, they can also, those words typically would come up in the introduction, and then they'd be typical military history, right? That would talk about the X's and O's and the movements of the units and the tactics and everything, which undeniably Lee was very good at. But the author, interestingly enough, says that he was so good at it that he kept the South in the war for much longer than they should have been, which resulted in,
Which is why-
ironically.
Just why he's revered at West Point. Because of his tactics and his ability to keep a truly lost cause. He should have given up a couple of years earlier, just due to loss of life.
Yeah, so there's, just like books like this, or, Remember the Alamo, the book that comes out now that re-examines the myth of Remember the Alamo. A lot of the history now that is being taught about the Civil War is focusing less on Lee's greatness and some of the Northern generals, the Army generals' ineptitude. Okay, especially in the Army of Northern Virginia, which has always been the case. It's just not been focused on. Again, the myth of, the Southern lost cause and the greatness of Lee was, well, Lee, of course, the South won all of these battles initially because Lee was so great and their cause was so just. And, they were fighting against, the Army of Northern or the War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah.
Right. But now the history's going back and starting to look at some of the decisions that were made by the Army leaders at the time, and how bad some of those were, not only on the battlefield, but in how the Army was supplied. And so some of the history now is focusing on two people that sort of caused that the North to turn around. One of them was Grant, who had gotten out of the Army and was in Southern Illinois, and basically, a failed, drunken businessman, basically, is how he was portrayed in the past, and probably not inaccurately. But how he took a look at the whole situation, and what did he decide to do? He decided to start fighting in the Western theater, okay, and gain momentum and serve to isolate Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. But also a guy named Montgomery Meigs, who nobody knows who that is, right? But probably the greatest of all the Civil War generals in the North. He was the quartermaster, and he was the one that ensured that campaigns and momentum could be built in the North, especially on the East theater against Lee, by supplying. Okay.
What was his name?
Montgomery Meigs.
Meigs.
Meigs, Meigs, maybe.
Okay.
I can't remember. I'm trying to picture. And so, as a short aside, I served under his great grandson, who was my division commander when I was a lieutenant, and then was the usurer commander, retired as a 4-star general. One of the better 4-star generals in the Army in the last 20 years of the 20th century as well. So must be something in their water. Yeah, so I mean, undeniably, Lee was a good tactician, but focusing less on some of that than who was across the battlefield.
Well, it says 3 out of 4 Confederate soldiers were either killed or wounded, or, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Statistics for a general, my goodness.
Right, and well, so the author does pull out that statement, I mean, and sort of hits you over the head with it. Think of all the wars the United States has been involved in, from the Revolution all the way through the War on Terror. Okay, the last 20 years since 9/11. He says that no other enemy officer in American history was responsible for as many deaths of more U.S. Army soldiers than Robert E. Lee. And that doesn't even count the ones in the South.
Yeah.
Okay, that's just the Northern, the U.S. Army. He said that in the last year of the war alone, 127,000. Right? Yes. So treason, yes, and slavery, absolutely. Okay. But also Lee was one of the key authors of that post-war Southern myth, the lost cause myth. Okay. And it wasn't like he was sitting there writing, like intentionally. It was actually a coming together, like we'll read here later, of the circumstances of, how now do we reconstruct the nation, bring it back together? Okay, because if you remember, everybody, General Sherman, right? Everybody's heard of him, right? March to the Sea. That it's the same kind of mentality as in World War II on the Berlin, right? You got to let the Germans know that they were defeated at the end of World War II, right? Because what happened at the end of World War I? It was the military had this idea that the civilians sold them out. Okay, has anybody seen the newest version of All Quiet on the Western Front? Yeah. Yes, no. So what happens is that there's a civilian who is the one that is authorized by the government to negotiate the settlement, the Versailles Treaty, and the whole story of it was done in train cars and all of that. But it's a civilian guy that does this, and then you have, after the treaty's been signed and the war is going to stop on November 11th at 11 a.m., right? The 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month. You have this crazy German general who wants one more battle. He wants his territory to end up on the German side. So he has it like 10:45, pushes off on an assault, right? But there was this myth that the German army didn't lose World War I. They were sold out by the civilians. The civilians lost, their spine, right? And that then, led to this terrible treaty that then created the Weimar Republic and hyperinflation and all of that, which then, of course, led to the rise of Hitler, okay, and the Nazis, the National Socialists, and so. That was the Civil War, obviously before that, but they wanted the South to know they were defeated. Okay, which is why Grant had Sherman do the March to the Sea, and then continue on fighting Lee until at Appomattox. He recognized, so he didn't even, there was a very distinct part in history where he saw, after one of the battles, the unorganized retreat, basically all the last 10,000 or so soldiers in one battle, I forget what it's called, running away. That's when Lee realizes, okay, they devastated, he was getting reports of devastated, the South, and I literally don't have the means to fight, which is why he surrendered. But post-war Reconstruction then was like, well, how are we going to bring the country back together, okay, and heal? And so while they continued on with some policies that were somewhat, unpopular in the South, they let the people in the South create this myth that allowed them whatever kind of saving face or whatever. It was, might defeated right kind of arguments. And they drew on some of Lee's writings.
Overwhelmed them with supplies and people.
Yeah, well, because
they had too many.
Yep.
Too many supplies, too many guns.
And in fact, the author says that, where Lee wrote specifically that his defeat was might over right. And again, we go back to Montgomery Meigs, the quartermaster. The South succumbed to overwhelming numbers and resources. But the author says, well, okay, all the writings and the romanticism of the South in the early part of the Civil War, when they enjoyed the great battlefield successes, you read the writings, and if you watch Gettysburg and you see, Martin Sheen playing Lee, making these grand, religious pronunciations. Yes, the Lord is with us on the field this day, and all of that. Well, the author, although he doesn't put it in religious terms, he says the South actually had fewer resources, maybe because their cause was wrong. Right? Okay. But that goes straight back to this idea of slavery as the economic model. The South didn't have the resources, they didn't have the people, because they didn't have to have 200 white people working in the cotton fields. they had one master and 199 slaves. But when the master went off to war, 200 people didn't go, just one, right? So that's what he was talking about there. And that's sort of a veiled reference to something we'll read about in one of the earlier chapters.
And a lot of the slaves fought or unslaved, whatever you call them, fought for the North, whatever the number was, 100 and some phenomenal amount.
Yes. Now, some of the most fascinating stories, military history that I read was of Sherman marching to the sea. And one of their big problems was they were bookended by the Southern Army in front of them and this growing army of free Black people that were following them. And they intended, the freed slaves, or they probably weren't even freed. They just were, freed people following Sherman, and they intended to follow him all the way wherever he was going, right back up to the north and be free, and so it was logistically, how do we deal with fighting the army to our front, but, provisioning all of these folks behind us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought about that. I was thinking about that idea of who, they weren't getting resupplied. Well, there was nobody, no other country, no other anybody was going to support the Southern cause. Slavery was, by that time, was illegal in Europe. It was, it was shutting down. And so nobody was gonna come in and help them, to win. That was politically worldwide. They were getting, they weren't gonna get, no Lafayette was gonna come, or whatever was gonna come and help them. From
Even there, and again, the Southern myth, doesn't get to that part of sitting in England going, yeah, well, we just got rid of slavery ourselves. They painted it more in terms of, the weak British who want access to our cheap cotton, right, for their shirt industry or whatever. But, they were looking and they were like hedging their bets and said, well, if the South wins, of course, that's going to be our market. So they blame the British for sitting there just sort of waiting to see, not wanting to side with the South and be cut off from the Northern industry. Again, might over right. So
yeah, but it had to do with their cause was.
Yeah.
It was,
Yep.
We can't support that because it's based on this whole thing of slavery. And I don't think that at the time anybody was not really clear about why the South seceded. It was economic, of course, but it was based on slavery. And it was going to be really hard on the South to give up slavery economically. But it doesn't seem to me like at the time there was any doubt about why they seceded. That there was no doubt that it was about slavery. That's something that came after. And to me, it seems like that was totally an effort on the part of the South to save face and to make excuses, because why would they make such a big deal about it wasn't slavery if they didn't also realize that there's a lot of people who think this is wrong, and maybe I personally don't think it's wrong, but it seems to me like the world doesn't think that slavery is right, and so I've got to make up some other reason.
sort of like a little
After the fact.
It's right.
bit of Hamlet there, right? The lady don't protest too much these days,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
So how do we feel or think about even in this chapter where he just damns Lee, undeniably, how does he do it though as a historian? Yes, he doesn't want to go too far overboard. I got the sense, where people just be like, oh yeah, an apologist. And I mean, he has to, I think the phrase he used, he needed to account for Lee's life in full. Right. And which he does in earlier pages of the book. And so he takes a look at Lee and, you know, for the bulk of Lee's life and looks at some of the things that he did that were, not good, but, you know, that shows an exceptional person. Right. So some of the examples are when he was at West Point, and this is the one I remember. I mean, one of the glorification of Lee is this, you know, Southern gentleman and a figure bigger than life. Right. And this is a person who almost got kicked out of West Point and ended up walking area tours. I mean, I don't even know how many demerits I had because they were uncalculable. But, you know, we got to, you know, then if you get enough demerits, then they make you on the weekend dress up in your full parade outfit, carry your rifle and just walk back and forth in the central area, and they call it walking the area. And so most people there's very few people that go through without walking the area. But they have a special title for those that are, you know, incredibly proficient at it, called century men or century women. And those are cadets that somehow manage to serve 100 or more hours on the area. So, and it's hard to do and still remain as a cadet. But so they had this myth about Lee, who went through 4 years of West Point and got no demerits, right? But then the author says, well, no big deal. 5 other people in his class did it, and there was, you know, probably 30 people in his class, right? And so, you know, he says, well, okay, so this again is part of that. I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, that's hard to do, go through and not get a demerit, right? But it can be done. Then he highlights Lee's performance 25 years later, or 22 years after he graduated class of 1825, as an officer in the War with Mexico, right? About how he became known as a warrior and like the best Army officer in the Army at the time. And I've read a couple of history books about what Lee did in the War with Mexico. Hey, I mean, it's good. I mean, but you know, being a great Army officer and a brave person and a tactician and all that still doesn't excuse what you know, what have you done for me lately? You know, hey, 4 years of fighting on the wrong side of the Civil War. Okay, so you had a couple of good weeks in Mexico, you know, when you were younger, which is sort of amounts to. Then he came back to West Point as the superintendent, right? Which now is like the superintendent is like the president of a college, you know, and it's a 3-star general, and they've had, you know, they've had 4-star generals take a demotion to be a 3-star general just to be the superintendent, you know, and it's that kind of a prestigious posting. In fact, in 1976, they had fired the current, or then the superintendent. I forget what his name was, but that's when they decided to integrate and bring women into the federal academies in 76. The first women graduated in 1980. They called all the superintendents from the 5 federal academies at the time and said, okay, starting this year, we're going to bring women in to the freshman class. And the superintendent of West Point literally said, over my dead body. And then the Secretary of the Army said, okay, well, before you leave the Pentagon, I'll have your letter of resignation on my desk. And so it was written, and so it was done. And they brought a retired 4-star general, Andrew Goodpaster, out of retirement and made him the superintendent just to be able to do that with the women. But now it's a very prestigious posting. Back then, it was a lieutenant colonel posting and not desirable when he was there in 1852. The academy was only about 50 years old. It was seen as off of the line, so to speak. And so an administrative post, and basically the superintendent was a babysitter. And Lee wanted none of that, right? But he went and did it. And did it fairly well. And so that's sort of the pre-Civil War, and Lee then shortly thereafter was selected by General Scott, his sort of mentor and the senior Army officer at the time, to go put down the uprising, John Brown's uprising at Harper's Ferry, right? But then the author comes to the point, he says, yeah, no, Lee was undoubtedly a really good Army officer, maybe the best of his generation. But it's not that guy that I wanted to grow up and be. You know, it was the Civil War general, the Southern gentleman, fighting the cause that he wanted to emulate. Okay.
Yeah. So you were starting out to say, how did he sort of back it up and make sure that he was legitimate and not just writing something that people would set aside, but he brought it kind of back to himself, I think, where he said, I was raised this way. I grew up in a white neighborhood that was purposely unsegregated, and I believed in the Southern myth, so that but he saw, he kind of saw the light. He learned, and a lot of it, by the way, had to do with his wife.
Yes.
but yeah, he legitimizes it by saying, I went through that, I believed in it, but I didn't get blinded by it. And I turned around and I could, I researched it, and all his research comes forward to be able to say, well, this is why I changed. And it's possible for others, but Lee was not able to see that. He was so blinded by it and so entrenched in it that he
wasn't even blinded by it. That's what he believed.
That's what he believed.
Yeah, Lee, I mean, he didn't like black people. He loved owning slaves. He liked being rich. He liked being a 4-star general instead of a colonel. So yeah, I mean, your point about the author turns it back on himself. And when I was sitting in church this morning during the scripture reading, the first one, not the second one, beautifully done, Marie, but the first one where John said, hey, when Jesus says, I didn't come to save, these folks, I came to save these folks, the sinners, I came to call them. He's not talking about Matthew and the tax collectors. He's talking about the Pharisees, right? People misinterpret that. So chapter 7 called the verdict. Okay. It's not only about Lee. In fact, I'd argue it's more about the author. Verdict about himself. I mean, he takes himself to task pretty hard.
But Lee truly didn't see his slaves as human.
Nope.
He saw them as nothing more than another type of cow or sheep.
Yep.
And I think that is part of the underlying unspoken foundation of the racism that comes forward, is there's this unspoken sort of, I don't even want to call it a belief. It's this understanding that those people with the dark skin, not only is their skin darker than mine, but their brains don't work as well, and their morals are not as strong, and they're lesser. They're not to be trusted. They're not to be relied upon. They're not to be, and nobody ever says that anymore.
But what do they say? What do they say instead?
Based on.
What's the typical Southern response to that? Well, no, I mean, look, I have Burke, my personal footman. I love Burke, or what would Scarlett O'Hara say? I love Manny. So love the individual, abhor the race.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and just the sense of, even if you love the black people, well, that you need to take care of them. They need help from you. They can't, it's this whole, I've got to help you get through the world. I've got to teach you to be moral. I've got to help you get a little smarter. because on your own, you just wouldn't be up to it. You just wouldn't
Pets,
be up to
so
it.
they use, somewhere in there, he used the word pet,
Yes,
pet.
yes, the house.
So who talked about his wife? Custis, right?
Yeah.
So there was a book, and I think that it was here, or I read it somewhere, doing some other research for this. But Mary Custis, his wife, wrote a biography.
Oh, you're talking about Lee's?
Yeah, Lee's wife.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But I was talking about the author's wife,
Oh, well,
that she helped him see the light.
well,
It's like kept Lee in the dark.
well,
Yes.
but yeah, she actually wrote a biography about her husband that was unpublished until I think just recently. I mean, like a couple of months ago
Oh,
or
really?
weeks ago that they got published. And part of it, because in here she says Lee's wife was surprised that he went with the South,
Yeah,
you know, and Lee's whole family was surprised, you know, and the author brings it up in response to, well, we of course got pressured to join the South by his family, or got, you know, all the Southern Army officers, you know, left the Army to go fight in the cause. A lot of them did, and there's a lot of stories about West Point, you know, on the eve of the Lincoln's election, what's going to happen, or who's going to stay, who's going to go, and these, you know, big dinners of farewell and see you on the other side, and kind of thing among the cadets and the faculty at West Point. But there's some thought that this biography that Lee's wife wrote about him was suppressed from publication because it would have gone, a lot of it would have gone against the myth, you know, and talked about how, like you said, Johnny, think of this, got 2 years off from the Army,
Yes.
full pay, full benefits, everything, to go take care of his father-in-law's will, of which the essential part was, you know, free all my slaves, you know, give them, and you know, he was granted that by Winfield Scott, you know, the senior, it was like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, giving me, you know, 2 years off to go, you know, take care of personal family business in the middle of a wartime. So yeah, a lot of stuff not known about him. Any other thoughts?
I was gonna make a comment. I grew up in the north, in New Jersey, but I've been in Texas for 42 years, but we always had and my mom would take us to demonstrations and, you know, MLK type, down in Newark, New Jersey. And we always thought of, oh, we're the liberals north. We don't have any racism here. And I took a sociology class at college, and there was a black woman in it, and she was from, I think, Alabama or something like that. But she said, you know, y'all talk about not having racism in the North. She goes, actually, it's more subtle, and we did a whole, even back then, a whole thing on institutional racism. She said, the one thing I like about the South is at least I knew where I stood. They all hated it. But here it's more subtle. It's not in your face. And I thought, wow, that really hit me strong. And then you start to unpeel what there is in institutional racism, where they're blocked out. And I guess I know it's not at the end, but they talk about how all the blacks left Georgia, you know, and moved to the north. And they lost all that resource, but you know, they moved north. Anyway, I just thought that was an eye opener for me back then. So I guess maybe what I'm saying is that the South myth is also, there's a lot of it in the North.
It's definitely not binary, right? No, it's not black and white.
Yeah, I think it's some of the worst beatings were in like Brooklyn, you know,
In Harlem.
Harlem.
Yeah. I think we in the South, my sense as growing up in the South was when I came to visit, relatives in the North, there was this fear that wasn't there in the South because, Black people were around. There was I never felt afraid of Black people. They were just people, and maybe there was this subtle undercurrent of they're not as smart as me or whatever, but I wasn't, afraid to sit next to somebody. I wasn't afraid to talk to somebody. Went to go in to visit in the North and flipped out because we were on a bus. I was a little kid. We were on a bus somewhere. And I sat down next to some guy and he asked, he was a nice man and asked me a couple of questions that one would ask an 8-year-old, that's visiting. And we got off the bus. My man freaked out because she was sure that because it was a Black guy, which never even, didn't penetrate, but she freaked out because she was just sure that man had done something horrible to me. Because I was a little white girl and he was an evil, scary guy who you can't sit next, you can't, and I just, even at the time, I thought, what? Why would she think that? He was nicely dressed. There was nothing scary about it. I don't know. So I think, I think it's a familiarity and it is a different kind of racism. It's very much the same in the effect, but the way it manifests is different.
That's the manifestation of that. So like we talked about earlier, where in the South, they love the individual, abhor the race. What do they say about the North? They flip it around and they say in the North, you love the race, but abhor the individual, right? So, your experience with the one guy on the bus, right?
I know 64 in Rockford, Illinois. I was part of a drum and bugle corps when I was in junior high school, and it was really great. I got to meet lots of folks. And we were going to a restaurant, and there was one of us in our color guard was Black. And we walked in and sat down, and they refused to serve that one person. And we all got up and left and went to another restaurant.
Good.
But that was the first time that I had ever experienced the blatant refusal in Illinois at that point.
Wow.
I know, when you go back to even the writing of the Constitution, the whole part of trying to get the Constitution written, or the Declaration of Independence written, you had the southern states who walked out basically because they were trying to get rid of slavery at the time. And if you've ever seen 1776, there's a wonderful segment in it where it talks about who's really in the wrong, the slave owners or the people who are running the slave trade. But the North is equally guilty in the fact of slavery as the South. And, I think that happens in, like you just said, in race, there's racism in the North too.
Well, in fact, one of the underlying currents in some of the chapters we'll read is that the North is complicit in it, because again, it was from, you talk about writing the Constitution, right? So what's the great compromise in the Constitution?
Yeah, actually, it's the Declaration of Independence.
Okay, but in the Constitution.
And the Constitution too.
Right, so they say the great compromise there was, the Bill of Rights, but no, it's when you have written into the Constitution that a slave is counted as what? 3/5 of a person, right? But the author thinks that the North is complicit there, because they allowed, and in some cases, he argues, supported or promoted the creation of the Southern Myth to, we'll just let them, whatever they want to say, it's okay, because they knew they lost, right? We know we won, so let's get along with it, right?
Try to put the country together.
I'm not sure that was a bad idea, really.
Expedience at the time, right? But then that's what he said, and that's the start. But then the farther away, good idea with the road to hell paved with what? Good intentions, right? So you can see that initial start point, right? And it's off. It gets off kilter pretty quickly, and then over hundreds of years, you're not just this far off. you keep going out, and all of a sudden you're this far away, right? And we'll hear of a couple different ways how that happens. Again, through the lens of military and West Point, where we talk about monuments to old Confederate generals, naming of Southern Army bases, things like that. And then at West Point, basically naming everything and the superintendent's dog after Lee, right? Lee Gate, Lee Road, Lee Housing, Lee Barracks, Lee Ward, all of that stuff.
And at West Point is a lot, and are all those things are named after Lee, are they still named after Lee? Or has that changed?
I have two classmates that are department heads back there. Actually, one just retired. I have to find out what the status of all of the renaming.
Because
is.
all the renaming going on.
But it's not, it's Lee, but then there's tons of, there's just so much. So that,
Named after something,
in fact, and then Congress gets a vote, right? Because it's a federal, and so there was a big to-do about, and this came up talking about the first time they started talking about getting rid of Lee's stuff around there, and they were like, well, wait a minute, okay, they flipped the argument, right?
Yeah.
Hey, let's not talk about all the stuff that's there about Lee. How come we don't have a statute of Grant? 4-star general, one Civil War became president. We didn't have a statute of Grant. And so there's a committee at West Point that gets to work sort of independently about monuments and all that. They're like, nah. There's enough stuff here named after Grant, barracks and some other stuff. They're like, no. And then oddly enough, one of the Southern politicians was going to do something stupid, like hold up all the promotion lists that the Senate has to,
Which we're doing right now.
yeah, exactly, over something else. We're going to hold this up and block this until you put a statute of Grant there. So when I went back and took Scotty there, there's what, I almost bumped into it. I'm like, what the hell is this? And it's off sort of in some, crazy. Yep. But yeah, we'll learn about that. But to close, before we do our closing prayer, what does the author say the answer is?
teach history.
Bingo. He says, and it's the last words in there, more education, more history. To create a more just society, we must start by studying our past. If we want to know where to go, we must know where we've been. Right?
It has to be the correct.
And it has to be the correct.
Well, but that's what he says. And he actually, before he gets to that point, he talks about some of the good things as a historian. He says, there's there's a proliferation of museums, primarily among the South now, about slavery and lynchings and all of that. He says, one of the few things that everybody in America can pretty much agree on, although to varying degrees, is that the civil rights movement was a good thing. But yeah, facts, and more facts.
But then you look at what's happened since he wrote the book.
Yeah, that's what
We're getting rid of a lot of history.
They're trying to get all that.
They're trying to take all that back out again. And it's
Yeah.
just like,
And that is so,
Well, his
for people who love history, that is so.
epilogue
Yeah,
talks
that's
about that, the Charlottesville. I didn't use it yet. Yeah.
But now we.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that great discussion. Thank you very much. And we will go back now, past his prologue, right? So we'll go back and take a look at the introduction in the first couple of
2
chapters.
weeks, not next week.
Right,
No,
next
no
week
class
is
next week.
Men's Leadership Sunday and Father's Day. We will not have class. So the next time we'll get together is on the 25th, right? Kitty, is that, I can't see if that's my mom or my
Yeah,
dad.
It is, or somebody.
Okay, there's, all right. Anything from our virtual community? And I think Marcelo looked like dropped off.
He had to go to a lunch birthday.
Okay.
The thing that struck me, because I experienced segregation still at 1990. in Alexandria, Virginia. But the thing that struck me was when Lee would punish his slaves and the overseer refused to do it. So he called someone else to come in and do it. That really bothered me.
That's the opposite of the Southern General.
Yes.
Yes.
And my parents, I see they retired to Williamsburg, Virginia. My sister went to William and Mary, played soccer, and so they kept going down there so much that I think they just ended up retiring there. And my dad, for a number of years, was a docent at Colonial Williamsburg. And was there. I'll tell the story, Dad. You can correct it next week. But he was there while they started to introduce authentic role playing with the slaves and the freedmen in Colonial Williamsburg. Because when you go there, they have people in period dress speaking the way that they do, and just walking, and you can come up to them and say, hey, where's the parking lot? And they're like, parking lot? What do you, so they're in period. And they said that my dad told me that when they first started doing it, and they would have Black people walking around dressed as slaves, doing slave kind of stuff. And tourists would come up to them and be like, what are you doing here, man? Run away, get out of here. What do you, why, how are you allowed to talk like that? So, educating. And
What role did your dad play at Williamsburg?
Oh, I don't think you were a role player. He was like a tour guide and would
Okay.
walk people around.
So
And
he
point out
wasn't
the
doing
different-
history.
No.
You know where the parking lot was.
Yes, that was his job was.
That sounds like a pretty fun job. Love Williamsburg.
Yes. Okay, so actually, let's do the closing prayer corporately as well. I think that worked out. So please join me in the closing prayer. O merciful God, grant that we with the strength of your divine hand might protect and serve one another. May all
Forms of hatred cease.
You are the seer of suffering, and it is
Close to us as contours of.
May your presence be a balm to those who are suffering and a bright flame to those who are causing injury. Rupture the status quo and create violence that infects our land, and teach us through your divine word to reject the lies of any false peace in favor of the presence of your dangerous justice. Thank you, Kitty, Mom, Dad.
Bye.
See you later. Happy anniversary again. 51 years yesterday.
Hey, John Boy, thanks for inviting us in.
Oh, always welcome. See you next week.
So what's your mom, dad?
Joan and Harold. I don't know how we stop. I guess we just end this.